First of all, l'chaim. And mazel tov for the Siyem. We know that the Gemara says that when you make a Siyem and a Mesichte or something like Harambam, which is Keil Kol HaTeira Kula, you have to make a Yom Tov Rabbanan, you have to make a Suda, it's the Suda's mitzvah. So you could wish mazel tov, and just like you finished this time the Rambam, you should continue, learn more and more and more, until the end of the Rambam will come true. What the Rambam says that the last two prokim, he talks about the coming of Mashiach, and he finishes off that Mashiach will come be Kamaim Layon. Mol ha'oretz deyas Hashem Kamaim Layon Machasim. It should be B'Koriv Mamish very, very soon. L'chaim. As we heard that the Siyem is taking place today, which is Gimel Tammuz, and Gimel Tammuz is the Rebbe's Yom HaYilula, and everything is Ashgocha Pratis. So it's a big special day when we put the two together. Now sometimes we find the inyan of Ein Ma'arvin Simcha B'Simcha, that you can't mix two things. And one of the reasons is why Ein Ma'arvin Simcha B'Simcha is because each one takes away from the other. And sometimes we find that there are certain things that they don't take away from each other, farkert. They strengthen each other. In this case, the Siyem Harambam and Gimel Tammuz don't take away from each other. Each one is mechazik the other. Besides the fact that the Rebbe was the one that made the takon of learning Rambam, so Gimel Tammuz, which is the Rebbe's Hilula, and the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that on the day of Hilula, the whole maisim tevim of somebody that the tzaddik that he did throughout his whole lifetime gets together. You can imagine how kind of great kedusha there is. So the specialty of the Rebbe, which is the Baal, the person who was Mesak Rambam, goes together. And if we'll have a chance later to talk about it, the connection between the Rebbe and the Rambam, and that's what the Rebbe gekocht the Rambam, the emissaries, all Chassidish Rebbes were known that they had a special chavivus to the Rambam. Everyone has a chavivus to the Rambam. You can't say a pilpul in Advar Teire without having a Rambam. But by the Rabbeim, it was a special chavivus of the Rambam, and we might get to that later if we were able to. But the first thing is that we have to talk a little bit about the takon of the Rebbe of learning Rambam. And I'm sure the people here heard probably a lot about it throughout all the years, and there's people here who learned the Rambam, so they know the nekuda behind the specialty of learning the Rambam. But as we heard before, it's kedai always to repeat it again, to be mechazik yourself, what you accomplished by learning the Rambam. We know the Rambam wrote Kol HaTeira Kula. The Rambam wrote all the halachas, not like the Shulchan Aruch, which only wrote about the halachas that are negei bisman hazeh. The Rambam wrote even the halachas of La'osid Lave, the halachas in the time of Mashiach, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. He wrote Kol HaTeira Kula. And a person, it says in Hilchas Talmud Torah, has to learn Kol HaTeira Kula. And that's what the Rambam has. The Medrash says, Ein hagolius miskanses ele b'schus hamishnayis. The golius will be ingathered. That says the geula will come in the schus of mishnayis. What's the mile of mishnayis dafke? Because mishnayis is halacha psuka. Mishnayis is basically halacha. In Gemara is big shaklevatari, all kinds of discussions. And b'schus of halacha psuka, was halacha is called the rotzen Hashem. The schus of learning the halachas kamei shehem in mishnayis, that'll bring Mashiach. Now the Rambam is similar. The Rambam also. The Rambam has more than Mishnayos, but he has from the Gemara, from the Chuvas Hageinim, halachas, as the Rambam writes in his Akdam, it's halachas. So whatever the Medrash says that Mashiach will come, b'schus ha-Mishnayos, certainly that'll be b'schus of the Rambam. And we know the greatness of the Rambam Sefer. The Rambam has a haskome from somebody very, very great. Even though if you open the Rambam, you don't see a haskome. Usually a sefer, you open up, you see the haskome. We don't see a haskome on the Rambam. But in Seder Adeiros, as the Rav mentioned before, from the Seder Adeiros, he quotes that the Rambam, if I remember correctly, wrote his sefer, Yad HaChazoka, Mishnah Torah, he wrote it took him 10 years. When he finished, he fell asleep, and he opened his eyes. I don't know for sure if he saw it in a cholam b'chezoyen or he saw it live. He saw his father standing next to him. His father had passed away years before. He saw his father standing next to him. And next to his father was another person. And he asks his father, who is that person? And his father said, it's Moshe Rabbeinu. And he said, Moshe Rabbeinu came here. He heard you wrote a sefer. He wants to see it. So he took the Ksovim and he showed it to Moshe Rabbeinu. Imagine, the Rambam showed Ksovim to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu looked through it, and Moshe Rabbeinu, I think there's one girsa that he gave him a kiss on his forehead, but that's not every girsa. And Moshe Rabbeinu said to him, Yasher Koyach, which means that Moshe Rabbeinu gave the Rambam a Haskam on his Sefer. So, the Rambam Sefer is the Sefer that has the halachas of Kol HaTorah Kula. The Mechaber himself, the Rambam himself, the Gedusha of the Rambam is Ein L'Shayer ve'Ein L'Tayr. We can't imagine. There were people in the time of the Rambam that did not know his godless and they had Machlokes, but the people who knew the Rambam, the Gedusha was so great that in Kaddish, in the area of the Rambam, in Kaddish, they used to say that but the b'chayeichen of Yemeichen u'v'chaye the Rabbona Meisha b'Maimen. They mention him in the Kaddish because his Kedusha. We know that the Rambam has an interesting shita that there's no such thing as shadim. Shadim don't exist. The Rambam writes it's all fake. There's no such thing as shadim. You know, all the Mefarshim ask, how do you say such a thing when the Gemara is mole about shadim? Not only that, they tell a story that some of the Rabbonim in his city wanted to prove to him that there are shadim. There was a haunted house, as they call it, in the end of town, which was full of shadim. So they said to the Rambam, we're going to show you there are shadim. So he said, fine. So they took him to the end of the city, and guess what happened? When the Rambam came, they weren't there anymore. Because of the Gedusha of the Rambam, seien sie in this battle geworden. The Gedusha of the Rambam. The Rambam's greatness is something unbelievable. There were Gdei Yisrael that said that had the daughter of the Rambam been Zeiche for the coming of Mashiach, Rambam would be Mashiach. He actually came from Malchus Beis David. He's from Shevet Yehuda. He's a descendant of David HaMelech. Came from Rabbeinu HaKodesh and from David HaMelech. So this is the greatness of the Rambam. And the Rambam wrote his Sefer, which is Sefer of Halachos, and the Rambam writes that he called the Sefer Mishnah Torah. Why? Because it's second to the Torah. In the Hakdama he writes, you could learn Chumash and then learn Rambam and you'll know all the halachas. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why there was a machlokes against the Rambam. Some people find it that because of this, people will stop learning Gemara. And it wasn't true. We see that the Rambam Sefer not only didn't take away from learning Gemara, it added chizuk in learning Gemara. And when you learn Gemara and then you look into the Rambam and you see the Rambam Psukim and you see he's a ganze shakel v'tarya, gives a sach amkis in learning Gemara. Another thing that the Rambam did that people, that Tainus, he changed the style. In Gemara we know there's shakel v'tarya in Gemara, but the Rambam did, before the Rambam, if someone wanted to paskin the din of Hilchas Shabbos, he had to know Gan Shas, because there is a Mesichta called Shabbos, but there are so many halachas which are in native, halachas and psachim, which have to do with Shabbos. So you have to know everything. Plus, even if you know the Gemaras, but you have to come to Psak halacha. Sometimes the Gemara says Hilchas, but most time the Gemara doesn't. How do you know what's the halacha? So what the Rambam did, he clarified it. He made all Hilchas Shabbos in all the halachas in Hilchas Shabbos. Whether it's in Shabbos, Mesichta Shabbos, or in Psochim, or in Yerushalmi, he put it all together. And he brought it l'halacha l'maisa. So on some people, this was, in the eyes of some G'deilim, this looked like a little bit modern. He changed the style from the way the Torah was being learned before. And they thought it'll take away from learning Gemara. The Pale, let's not forget, the opposite. This brought Mer Limud HaTorah, and this brought down l'halacha l'maisa. So, the greatness of the Rambam is something that we don't have to discuss, but it's always kedai when we're talking about the Siyem Harambam, and we're talking about continuing again and again and again learning Rambam. It's always good to review in your mind what the Rambam is and what his Sefer is. Since the minig is that when it comes to a Siyem, we have to talk really about Gimel Tammuz, but I think this is a Farbrengen. A Farbrengen, you have time, you read weiter, so we'll get to it and see how Gimel Tammuz and the Rambam go together, and what Gimel Tammuz is, what the Rebbe is. But the meaning is that by a Siyum, you say something which is negayah to the Siyum of what, whether it's a Mesichta or whatever you're learning. So it's interesting just to say a word from the Rebbe, it's a very geschmack word from the Rebbe on the Siyum of the Rambam. I saw you had the papers before the end halachas. Well, here. And as you heard before, we have to mekasher the end of the sefer with the beginning. So the Rambam says here, I'll read the words again, not because we heard a Siyem already, but it'll be negated to the idea that I'm trying to bring out. Be'ez Azman, when Mashiach will come, there will be no hunger, there will be no mulchama, there will be no jealousy, no competition. But then he says like this, the occupation of the whole world will be only about knowing Hashem. Listen to these words. Every word in the Rambam is meduyik. Eden will be big chachamim because they'll be learning so much. They will know the hidden things. And they will be masik. They will grasp the das of their creator as much as a person could. So the Rebbe asks, what are these two inyonim? The Rambam says, they will know dvarim astumim, the hidden things. What are the hidden things? Doesn't say what it is. They'll know the hidden things. And the second thing, yasigu das beiram, and they will grasp the das of their creator. Well, obviously, the hidden things that we're talking about, l'chura means the hidden things from the Gei Hashem. So what are the two things that they're going to know the hidden things, and they're going to know the das beiram, they're going to know the mind, the understanding, the daya of their creator, of the Eibishter. Kifi keyach adam. Here he adds kifi keyach adam as much as a person can. And the first thing that Rambam doesn't say, v'yedim dvarim astumim, kifi keyach adam. They'll know the hidden things as much as a person could. He says they'll know the hidden things, and they're going to be masig, they're going to grasp the das of the Eibishter, kifi keyach adam, as much as a person can. So the Rebbe explains as very gishmak. If you learn the beginning of the Rambam, Hilchas Yesodei HaTorah, the first prokim of the Rambam. So there are two prokim where the Rambam goes into explaining the Maise Merkava. Maise Merkava means all the ruchnisdike things that are going on Lamaila. The Maise Merkava in Gemara is referred to, the Pnimi is the hidden secrets of the Torah, the secrets of the Eibishter. That's called Maise Merkava. And the Rambam goes into two prokim explaining the Maise Merkava. Then he goes into two prokim explaining Maise Breishis, the creation. And the Rambam goes into explaining the depth of what's there in the Bria, in the creation. And the purpose why it's important to know the depth of the creation, because then we see Mo Rabu Masecha Hashem, Agodlu Masecha Hashem. We realize the greatness of the Eibishter's creation that brings us to have a connection to the Eibishter more. But the Rambam divides, there are two things. There is das, knowing the Maisem Rekove, and knowing the depth of Maisa Breishis. And it's interesting that when it comes to the writing of the Maisem Rekove, the Rambam writes that whatever I wrote is like a drop in the ocean. That's the Lashon he writes. It's like a drop in the ocean, because there's much more to it. He only wrote two prokim about it, so it's a drop in the ocean. When it comes to the end of the Maisa Breishis, when he explains the depth of the creation, the Rambam finishes off as saying, everything I wrote is a drop in the bucket. Why does the Rambam change? He wants to tell you that whatever you wrote is very little compared to what is there. So why by the Maisa Merkava, he says it's a drop in the ocean, and by Maisa Breishis it's a drop in the bucket? The answer the Rebbe says is very simple. The world, the creation is mugbal, is limited. It's like a bucket. Bucket is limited. What he wrote is a little bit of it. But a person can reach the depth of the complete Maisa Breishis. If you reach a high madrega, you could understand everything in Maisa Breishis. But the Maisa Merkava, that's something that's bli gvul. And that's something you could never reach. And that's why the Rambam gives the example, it's a drop in the ocean. We know in Gemara, the ocean is referred to as Mayim She'ein Lohem Sof. Has no end. It doesn't mean physically, Megashmi is the Mayim has an end, but when you look at it, you don't see an end. So it's called Mayim She'ein Lem Sof, it's like Ein Sof. So Maise Merkava is Ein Sof. That's the Eibishter, what goes on by the Eibishter, so the Rambam says it's a drop in the ocean, because the ocean is Mayim She'ein Lem Sof. When it comes to Maise Breishis, it's a drop in the bucket. It's taki, whatever you wrote is a little bit, but the whole Maisa Breishis is like a bucket. It's Yesh Leib Sof, and you can reach it. This is what the Rambam says at the end. When Mashiach will come, and Yidden will be Chachomim G'deilim. V'lei Yesek Kol Ha'elam L'das Hashem Bilvad. They only know Hashem. So what's going to happen? They're going to know both. They're going to understand the depth of the Ma'aseh Merkavah and the depth of the Ma'aseh Bereishis. So that's what the Rambam said. V'yedim Dvorim Hastumim. They're going to know hidden things because Ma'aseh Bereishis is hidden now. We don't know the depths of Ma'aseh Bereishis. The Rambam explains a little bit what's behind it. But we don't know. But Mashiach will come, they will know these hidden things. How much will they know of it? Completely. Because the whole Ma'aseh Bereishis is limited. And then he says, V'yasigu das beiram kvikei adam. They're also going to understand das beiram, which is the Eibusher, the creator, not the creation. And that is Bli Gvul, that's Ein Sof. They'll know much more than we know now. But it'll also be kvikei adam as much as a person could understand. So, this is what the Rambam says will happen when Mashiach will come, and that's what the Rambam says, these two Lashonos, because it refers to what he said in the beginning, which is what a person should think about to understand the Eibishter. Because there is a mitzvah in understanding the Eibishter. There is a mitzvah, da es Elokei avicha. You should know the God of your father, you should know. Interesting, if you look in the beginning of the Rambam, and we connect the beginning, the end to the beginning, the first halacha, as we heard before, Rabbi Marozov, the Rambam uses the Lashon Yeseid ha-Yeseidis v'amud ha-Chochmes. The next word, Leida sheyesha motzerishin. The foundation of all foundations, the pillar of all Chochmes, is to know that there is the first being. Interesting. We would expect the Rambam to write Yeseid ha-Yeseidis v'amud ha-Chochmes lahamin sheyesha motzerishin. To believe. We believe in the Eibishter. So the Rambam should have written that the foundation of everything is to believe that there is Eibishter. That's not what the Rambam writes. The Rambam writes, Leida she'esha motzerishin, to know. Which means we have to learn and try to understand. We have to understand as much as possible what the Eibishter is. We have to try to understand. Avad, the Yesod always has to be a munah. The Yesod is a munah. But on top and after we have the emunah, we know this is it. Now we have to try to understand. But yodaito hayom, kashavei salavevecha, yodaito, you have to have yediyah. And this is where Chassidus comes in. What's Chassidus? Especially Chassidus Chabad. Chabad is chokhmah bin das. The whole nekudah of Chassidus is to explain, to understand Achdas Hashem, the unity of Hashem. To understand what it means, Ein Eid Milvadei, that there is nothing but the Eibishter. But it's not something that's born from Chassidus. The Rambam says is, Leida she'esha motzerishin. And you know what the Rambam says? If you look, Poshet L'maisa halacha, he goes through in the first 5 halachas, he goes through certain protim b'negei the Eibishter, and then he says, at the end, in halacha Vov, beginning of halacha Vov, Ve'yedias dover zeh. He doesn't say amunas dover zeh. Yedias dover zeh, to know this, mitzvahs esse. It's a mitzvah esse. Everyone knows there's a mitzvah esse to put on tefillin. It's a mitzvah esse to matzah Pesach. Who's not going to do the mitzvah esse? It's a mitzvah esse. Why do you got to do it? The Rambam says Yedias dover zeh mitzvah esse. Shenemar aneicha Hashem Elokecha. So the Rambam refers to it as a mitzvah sese. All these 6 things are a mitzvah sese. So it's a mitzvah sese to learn and try to understand the inyan of Achdas Hashem, what it means, that unity of Hashem, that Ein Eid Milvadei, there's nothing but Hashem. We have to understand it. Even though I know that people ask that at the end of Perik Daled, the Rambam writes that what he wrote before in Ma'aseh Merkavah, Ma'aseh Bereishis, is called the Pardes. It says, there are 4 people who went into the garden. This is what it is, going into understanding the depth of Ma'aseh Merkavah, Ma'aseh Bereishis, the spiritual things that are going on. That's called Pardes. And then the Rambam writes something which seems to contradict what we just said. And the Rambam writes that in the end of Perik Dalet, he writes, Yone arboe prokim elu, heim shachobim keir nesa Pardes. Va'afa pishek delia, lei kulam mekeich leida, v'ani emer, she'ein royu letayel b'Pardes. It's not right to take a walk in this Pardes. Pardes means a garden. Unless you're first full of meat, bread and meat. And what is that? Basically, he says, you shouldn't be metayil in the pardes. You shouldn't take a walk in this pardes that we're talking about here. You should first learn, Parsha the halachas nigla, you should not learn. Now, this seems to contradict what I just said. But obviously, the Rambam is not going to contradict himself. The Rambam writes these halachas. Imagine, the Rambam writes these halachas, and what does he call these halachas? Yeseidei HaTorah. Imagine, he calls it the Yeseidei HaTorah, the foundation of Torah. So the foundation of Torah you shouldn't learn. Does that make any sense? And then he says, Yeseidei HaYeseidis, about this Yesod of the Yeseidis. And then he fears Zuis, the Adiyas Davazeh, Mitzvah Seseh. And then he says, no, don't do it, don't learn it. I just told you it's a Mitzvah Seseh. How does the Rambam say don't learn it? If you medayik in the words of the Rambam writes here, Ein royu letayil bepardes. To take a walk. What's such taking a walk? Taking a walk is leisure. There are certain fundamental things which is not leisure. That's something that you have to have. And then there is extra. You take a walk is like you eat dessert. It's something extra. After you're finished and you have everything you need, now you enjoy yourself, take a walk. That the Rambam says, Ein royu letayil bepardes. Letayil, why? He should have said, Ein to lekones lepardes. Arbo nichnas lepardes shall ein k'tai lekones. He says, Ein royu letayil bepardes. To go extra. And believe me, as much as we learn, we're not matayil yet. Matayil is a much higher madrege. When we learn, if you learn Chassidus, and you learn the biurim that is brought down in Chassidus, to explain, to be masbir in our seichel and nushi, in our poshet kop fagropte kep, understand a little bit the truth of Eineit Mavada, what it means there is nothing but Hashem, that is part of this mitzvah seseh. Mashiach will come, then the whole, it'll be Eisekol Elam Kul Das Hashem Bilvad. They'll be learning these things. That'll be the ikir. The Rambam, the Rasha says in Shir Hashirim on the posuk Yishakenim Yishikas Piyu that La'osid Lovei, when Mashiach will come, he will teach us Taima Torah, the deeper reasons of the Torah, which means all the spiritual inyonim that's behind the Torah. That's what we'll learn then. That'll be the ikir limud then. Now that's not the ikir limud, but we have to have it. That's the Yesoda Yesedis is to know this, and this is a beginning of the connection between learning Rambam, which teaches us this, and Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz, the Rebbe, which is brought more these inyonim of understanding in Seichel, push it to understand the emeskite of the Torah and the emeskite of the Eibishter and the emeskite of the Neshama. As we all know, this is what the Rebbe is. Rebbe was and the Rebbe is and gives this Hashpoah still. That is connected to what the Rambam writes in the beginning and the end. And we know the beginning is when you set down the tone. That's the yisod of everything. The Ed, the Gemara says, Hakol heilach achar achitum. No, it's tchilosam b'seifim b'tchilosam, which basically the Rambam's, all the halachas are sandwiched in this inyan of Yediyas Dover Zev Achdes Hashem, from the beginning and end. And we have to also, every time we learn, we also have to have this. And by the more we do this, this will be the best achonah to the coming of Mashiach, when we will all be learning this in a much deeper way, but we have to have a little bit of preparation now too. And when we do that, this will hasten the coming of Mashiach, will come by the Kodev Mamash, l'chaim, l'chaim. As I was mentioning before, that it's Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz is the Yom HaElulah, the yard site of the Rebbe. And it's Hashgocha Prot is that the Siyem Harambam comes out in the day of the Rebbe's yard site. And I was telling somebody, the first Siyem Harambam, this is the 40th, the first Siyem Harambam was Yud Aleph Nisan, the day of the Rebbe's birthday. And this time, the Siyem Harambam is on the day of the Rebbe's yard site. And I said to them, so the first was the day of the Rebbe's birthday, and the last one is in the Rebbe's yard site. Why is it the last? Because Mashiach is coming soon. So this is the last one is Maragos. No, this is Mashiach coming. So it's interesting that they're all connected to the Rebbe. Because the Rebbe was the one that made the Takone, and there's a lot of, we say, similarities between the Rebbe and the Rambam. First of all, in the Ge'enis, in the Ge'enis, in the Lomdes of the Rebbe, that anybody who is familiar a little bit with the Rebbe's Torah could see what kind of Lomdes, what kind of Ge'enis is there in the Rebbe's Torah. In all parts of Torah. Just like by the Harambam we see the Ge'enis in all parts of Torah, by the Rebbe we find all parts of Torah. The Sitkes of the Rebbe is something, like we said by the Harambam Sitkes was something unbelievable. In the Sitkes of the Rebbe, those that are a little bit familiar with the Rebbe's Seder Hayim, just like that, would see. But the Rebbe's inyan is how much he was just Ibrigem to Klal Yisrael, and his own Metzias did not count. He was Ibrigem completely to Klal Yisrael. What Klal Yisrael needs. And therefore, because he is a Rebbe's Rosh Tevis, Reish B'nai Yisrael, the head feels every part of the body. Reish B'nai Yisrael means when he feels every Yid as part of him. Someone told me once there was a Yid, Chassidus Sharid, not a Lubavitcher, who went into Yechidus to the Rebbe for a brocha for something. And before he walked out, the Rebbe asked him, can you repeat a word that your Rebbe said lately? Just to hear a word? So he said, yeah. My Rebbe asked the kasha. The Gemara says, Hafilu Pesha Yisrael Malei Mitzvahs Kerimen. Even the Pesha Yisrael, the Yidden who are not so good, Pesha Yisrael, imagine the title, Pesha Yisrael, are full of mitzvahs, like a pomegranate is full of seeds. So my Rebbe asked, if they're Pesha Yisrael, you call them Pesha Yisrael, how could you say that they're full of mitzvahs? So Rebbe tells him, I have the same kasha. But my kasha is, if they're full of mitzvahs, why do you call them Pesha Yisrael? It's a complete different pshat. The Rebbe was able to see in each person the depth of the person, the good that's in every person. And not only to see it, but to bring it out. To bring it out begilui. And the Rebbe cared about every single Yid. And there are so many stories told how the Rebbe would send shluchim just for one person. In other words, you could imagine a person like the Rebbe would be somebody who was involved in Klal Yisrael matters. A lot of people, daily Yisrael, involved in Klal Yisrael matters. The Rebbe is involved in Klal Yisrael matters, and at the same time involved in every yochid, in every individual as an individual. This is what a Nosibi Yisrael is. We just came from Parshas Kairach. There's an interesting pshat from the Rebbe in Parshas Kairach. Moshe Rabbeinu told the Reish Nunish, the 250 people, they should bring Torahs. And then the Pasuk says, Moshe Rabbeinu turned to the Eibishter and he said, Ve'al teifen el min chosam. Don't, he's asking the Eibishter not to turn to the karbonis of the people. So Rashi says two pshatim. One pshat Rashi says is, he meant the Torahs that they're bringing, please don't accept it. But then Rashi says another pshat. Rashi is like this. Moshe said, Yedeya ani, I know that each person has a share in the Korban Tzibur. Every day in the Mishkan and in the Beis HaMikdash, they would bring a Korban Tzibur. The Korban Tamid was a Korban Tzibur. A Korban that from the whole community, they took it from the fund that every Yid put into the fund, became one fund, and they used to take the money from that fund as a Korban Tzibur and bring every day. So Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Eibishter, these are the words that Rashi says, Yedeya ani, I know that every Yid has a chelik in the Korban Tzibur. So Keirach v'Adosei also have a chelik in the Korban Tzibur. So the Eibishter, please, don't accept their chelik. Don't accept their share of the Korban. Don't accept it. So the Rebbe asked a shaila, why does Rashi use the strange lashon when he said, Yedeya ani? Rashi should have said, Moshe said, every Yid has a share in the Korban Tzibur. Please don't accept their share. Why did he start off by saying, I know, Yedeya ani, I know that each one has a chelik in the Korban Tzibur. So the Rebbe says, Rashi is answering an interesting shaila. We know that when it comes to Tzibur, almost like the Yochid gets in his battle. There's no more Yochid. Every individual loses his individuality and becomes part of the Tzibur. The tzibur is an entity for itself. Avade, to have a tzibur, you have to have a lot of yechidim. But the yochid loses his identity as a yochid. It says in Gemara that if you gave something to the tzibur, meisrei letzibur, yofe yofe, you have to give it up to the tzibur and give up your identity. So what did Moshe Rabbeinu mean that I know they have a share everyone has a share in the korban tzibur? Don't accept their share. L'chura, they don't have a share in the korban tzibur. The korban tzibur is a new entity of a tzibur. The answer is like this. True, when you become part of the tzibur, the yochid loses his identity. But mitzad Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the Nasi Yisrael, no matter what happens, the yochid is important. The yochid is important as a yochid. That's why Rasha says, he said, Yedei ani, me, as being the Nasi, I know from my perspective, there's still, yochid is still counts. Even though Ba'etzem you would assume that the yochid gets lost in the tzibur, but I'm telling you, Yedei ani from Moshe Rabbeinu's side. Because this is the idea of Moshe Rabbeinu. The idea of Moshe Rabbeinu is the Nosei Ador, and not only from the door as a whole, from every single Yid. He is the one that cares about every single Yid, and that's why he said, Yedei ani. And this is what a Rebbe is, and this is what we saw by the Rebbe. So every Yochid is, the whole Tzibur is Negeya, and then every Yochid, when you went by dollars by the Rebbe, you felt that there's nothing in the world in the Rebbe's eyes but me. The Rebbe looked at you those 30 seconds, or when you asked something to the Rebbe. And there are so many stories how the Rebbe cared about every single Yid. I just told one of the people who walked over to me, asked me, tell me a story. So what should I tell? So this story came to my mind. I heard this from Rabbi Gutnik, who lived in Australia. He was like the chief rabbi, I think, of Australia. The Rebbe wrote him a letter once, he should travel to Tasmania. He didn't know why, like stories from the Baal Shem Tov, go someplace. So he went to Tasmania. He didn't know why he's going, so he went around, met people, and he would find out eventually what the Rebbe sent him for. He met this girl who was amongst there, no from a Yidden, there no Yidden Kemat Bichlal, and it was almost that she was holding by Shmadenzach to convert to Christianity because she had the peer pressure from the other people. But she didn't feel comfortable doing it. And this is what she told him. So she said, turned around and davened to the Eibishter. I heard that in every generation there is somebody who, a person down here, a rabbi, I don't know what Loshen she felt, that cares about every single Yid. And if that's the case, care about every single Yid, should care about me too. So I want to see a sign that there is such a person that cares about me, and me as a Yid and as an individual girl is important to the Eibishter. I want to see that. If I don't see it, then I'm giving up, I'm going to shmadzach. And this rabbi tells him, I got a letter from the Rebbe sitting in Brooklyn to come here, obviously to come to you and show you that the Rebbe is in Brooklyn and he cares about you as an individual. He cares about Klal Yisrael, the things that go on in Eretz Yisrael, and the Rebbe gefiert meisim for the teva of the Pikuach Nefesh of Yidden and the Union of Yehudi and the mehrere Sachen, Weltsachen. But at the same time, the Rebbe did all kinds of things to show his care for every individual person. And when it comes to Gimel Tammuz, we have to strengthen our hiskashrus to the Rebbe, because this is a day which is the Rebbe's day, and that's a day we have to strengthen our hiskashrus to the Rebbe. So this is one of the things you have to remember, that just like from the Rebbe's side, he cares about the tzibur and he cares about the yochid, we also have to connect ourselves and follow in the Rebbe's ways, being part of the tzibur, but also every individual has to feel that he has an achrayus to the Rebbe to do what the Rebbe wants. And even though it's after Gimel Tammuz, Tovshin Nun Dalet, and Begashmi is the Rebbe is not here with us. Take Begashmi is not here. It's true. But it says in Tanya from the Zayar that Tzadika de Yispater Ishtaker Bekul Alman Yater B'Mechayei, Tzadik that's Nifter, is in all the worlds more than before, even in Elam Haza Agashmi, in this world. So he's here more, and his Ashpoah is more. It's interesting. It says in Seder Eilam that there was some other event that took place on Gimel Tammuz. In Lubavitch, we know there's another event that the Frierdiker Rebbe was freed from jail on Gimel Tammuz. He was sent to exile in Kostroma, and then Yud Beis Tammuz he was freed. But in Seder Eilam it says that over 3,000 years ago, a very important historic event took place Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz. What was that event? Yeshua stopped the sun. It says Yeshua was at war, and it started getting night, and you couldn't fight the war at night. So Yeshua said, "Shemesh begivein daim," the sun should stop and not set in Givein, and the sun did not set. The machlokes in Gemara for how many hours it stayed, whether 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, that it stayed and it didn't set. It's a remes to us. It's a hint to us. A tzaddik is called the sun. And the Gemara says, V'zorach Hashem shebo Hashem, the Gemara says, when the sun sets of one tzaddik, the sun of another tzaddik rises. Yom shemes Rove, Neilad Revashe. The day Rove passed away, Revashe was born. And Bechlal we find, when one tzaddik goes, there's another tzaddik coming up. And that's hinted in the fact that it says, the sun sets and the sun rises. And that's what happened by all the Rabbeim. After the Baal Shem Tov, the Mezritcher Magid took over. After the Mezritcher Magid, you had the Talmidei HaMagid, and as far as Chabad is concerned, the Alter Rebbe continued, and from the Alter Rebbe to the Mittel Rebbe to the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek to the Rebbe Marash, and the Rebbe Marash to the Rebbe Rashab, and then to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and then it went to the Rebbe. So there was always the sunset. By the Rebbe, we see there is nobody who took over. So what's the pshat? The pshat is like Gimel Tammuz. Shemesh begiven daim, it didn't set. Now Begashmi is the Rebbe isn't here with us, but the hashpoas of the Rebbe continue like before and even more than before. We find it by Moshe Rabbeinu. When Moshe Rabbeinu was alive, the mon came down in the schus of Moshe Rabbeinu. But when Moshe passed away, the mon stopped going down. So what did they eat if they didn't have the mon? Passed away Zayin Oder. They weren't able to eat from the wheat, from the grain of Eretz Yisrael, of Eretz Canaan, till the second day of Pesach, which is Tez Zayin Nisan. So from Zayin Oder till Tez Zayin Nisan, what did they eat? So Rashi says that the mon that fell on Zayin Oder, which usually when the mon fell, it was enough for one day. This time, the mon lasted till they were able to have the food. Which means even though it came down because of Moshe, and Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't around anymore. But whatever was needed, the Ashpoah from Moshe Rabbeinu continued. And since we know Mashiach is coming very soon, so the Ashpoah, so it's not for a long time, so the Ashpoah of the Rebbe is still going on. There is a Yerushalmi, interesting Yerushalmi. It says in Yerushalmi a contradiction between two psukim. One pasuk says that Shimshon HaGiber was a shofet, was a judge for 20 years. Another pasuk says that Shimshon HaGiber was a shofet for 40 years. So Yerushalmi says, how do the two psukim fit? And the answer is really he was a shofet for 20 years, and then he passed away. But since for another 20 years his influence was felt, it's called that he is there, and he is called a shofet. Even though he wasn't there. He wasn't alive anymore. It's called that he is the shofet. So we see the same thing here, and we see by the Negei of the Rebbe that if you see what goes on, we all know what Lubavitch does and the growth and how much the hashpoah of the Rebbe is. Sayin the hashpoah ruchni and sayin the hashpoah of Gashmi. It's poshed in broches. People who go to the oil, every day you have hundreds of stories of people who go to the oil and they're helped. Mamish, like it was before. We don't see the Rebbe. It's hard for a person to have a iskashers when you don't see begashmias. But beruchnias, it's there. And Gimel Tammuz, which is a day that is called the Hilul, and the Hilul means a chasen there really. It means the special day of the Rebbe. This is a day that has to be me'eder within us. The strength that we have to strengthen our iskashers, which means to do what the Rebbe wants us to do, and to learn the Torah of the Rebbe. And by doing that, we connect ourselves to the Rebbe. And since the Rebbe is the Reish B'nai Yisrael, the head, so through that, we get connected to the Eibishter in a stronger form. Till very, very soon, Mashiach will come, and we will see the Rebbe again, Begashmis. L'chaim, l'chaim. Someone came over to me before and said, it's Gimel Tammuz. Maybe you say some stories of the Rebbe. Okay? You know, the Baal Shem Tov said that he wants that people should talk about him, not about his meifsim that he did, his miracles that he did, but about his Yirah Shamayim. Because it says that to do a meifes in the eyes of the big chassidim was a small thing. That's not important. But they said Benegei the Magid that some of the Talmidim of the Magid said, "Sag gewalgert meifsim unter den Tisch." But Magid, meifsim were rolling under the table. No one even bent down, bothered to pick it up, because that not what they were involved in. But nevertheless, a meifes is a meifes. And there's a letter from the Rebbe that he wrote to the Frierdiker Rebbe that it's kedai to tell meifsim, to tell stories, because it gives Yirah Shamayim. Maybe the generations before, people in higher madrege, they would look more in the ruchnias of inyanim. But we're simple people, and therefore, if you see a meifes that brings, like, so to speak, Gilui Elokus, you see there's a tzaddik, that a tzaddik has the keiches of the Eibush that gives a person a push to Yirah Shamayim. So I was just thinking, there are stories from their stories of the Rebbe Meifsim. There are probably thousands upon thousands. You can't imagine. Every time, by dollars, every time the Rebbe gave for many years, he used to give out Sunday dollars, and probably every Sunday 5,000 people went by. There was at least 100 Meifsim every time. And there are stories, and some things, sometimes people tie them when you have a meifes, it's made up stories. There are videos that you could see, videos actually of the time people walk by the Rebbe and you see what the Rebbe says. And you see Ruach HaKodesh things that the Rebbe says, actually, this is not what I'm saying Ruach HaKodesh, just comes to my mind. I heard from Harav Wolfson. Harav Wolfson was here in Borough Park. He's from the very, very Choshev Yidden. Everyone who knows about him is probably the most respected Yidden in Gans, New York. So he's a Geheben Nirid, Mamash a Geheben Nirid. So I was speaking to him. He comes to Miami every year, so I get a chance to speak to him a lot. So he wants to tell him. I asked him an outright question. I asked him, what made you become basically a chassid of the Rebbe? What made you to become a chassid? Because he always held of the Rebbe, but he became mamish, speaking to him, the biggest chassid, with such a skashas to the Rebbe. So he says he had many meifsim. But I said, so what clicked it? So he said, I'll tell you this. He had a meaning. He used to go every summer to Eretz Yisrael for a few weeks. So one year he went to Yerushalayim, and he happened to stay in a place which was right next to a shul, which was not used. It was like a churve, not the famous churve, but it wasn't used. It says, Punk, when he went then, one of his grandchildren was sick. And it was on his heart, on his mind. So every night when he would say Krishma Shalamita, he would go to that churve. No one was there. No one knew. And he would say Krishma Shalamita there. And he said, since his Einikl was sick, it was very emotional for him. He would cry a lot. And the reason he went there, he didn't want anyone to see that he's crying. He didn't want his Rebbe to see. So he went there. And he says, when he said in Krishma Shalamita, the posik, Leiv nishbar v'nitke elikim leisivze, that if you have a broken heart, Hashem doesn't embarrass it, doesn't push it away. He says, for some reason, he used to repeat the posik many times and cry a lot there. And cry a lot. And no one knew about it. Nobody, not one person in the world. Because it bothered him. When he came from Eretz Yisrael, when he came back home, Sunday he went to the Rebbe for dollars. He used to go pretty often. And the Rebbe gave him $1. Then he tells the Rebbe a broche for my Einikl. And the Rebbe said to him something to this effect. I can't say the exact lashon, something to this effect. When someone says, Leiv nishbar v'nitke, with great kavanah, the Eibishter helps. He tells me he almost fainted. No one knew that this was happening. Not even his wife. He said his Rebbetzin did not know. He especially made sure that you should know. No one knew. And he says the Rebbe said it to him. So he says, this clicked. And he says, this made him into a chassid. And he told me other little stories, not in the Geya, but everything showed that the Rebbe special, read his machshavas. The Rebbe said things that had to be said, which no one else knew. But this is something that Mamish made him into a chassid, because you see a mephus and you see the holiness that's there. So I want to say something that happened to us in Miami. People know about it because we wrote about it, but I can tell you here, I'm firsthand, so it's good always to hear a story firsthand. And there's the famous story, Benegaya, the Hurricane Andrew. Miami is an area where hurricanes happen. Every year now, actually, we just started the hurricane season. Some years it's worse, some things it's more. But this was when the Rebbe already had the stroke. It was right after the Rebbe had the stroke. And they were saying, and Andrew, the hurricanes go by the alphabet, so Andrew is A, so the first hurricane of the season. And they predicted a strong, very strong hurricane. And as the Seder is, first when they see it coming, they're not sure how it's going to go. So then it's a hurricane watch. And as it gets closer and it's more coming to your area, it's called a hurricane warning. So the hurricane was coming and they said it's a 3. It goes to a 5. A 3 is probably 160 miles an hour, winds are 150. Then you have a 4. A 5 is 170 or 180. It's mamish, it's gefährlich. So they said this is a 3. And as it got closer, they said it's a 4. And there was evacuation, that you had to evacuate. And the police went around with microphones saying everyone has to evacuate because Miami Beach is going to be the place where the hurricane is going directly, and it looks like it's coming straight to Miami Beach, and it's a 4, and it's going to be deadly. We even heard on the radio, they said that anybody who decides to stay, notify next of kin. That's how dangerous it is. So I remember when the day that they said that it's going to come that evening, I called 770, I called Rabbi Groner, and I said, go into the Rebbe and tell the Rebbe what's happening. Actually, I didn't say, I left the shul and I told my wife she should make the call. And I don't know why, when she called, she told him to ask the Rebbe if we should leave. I said, I didn't ask you to leave. Why can't we leave? It's not Eretz Yisrael, you can't leave Miami. He's like it, almost like, but not really. It's not Eretz Yisrael, so you can leave if you want. Why? What's the shaila if you could leave? But Eretz Yisrael is an Easter to leave. But Leibel, that's what she said, and Rabbi Groner asked the Rebbe, should they leave? And the Rebbe said no. Like this, he couldn't talk already. He shook his head. No. In those days when the Rebbe couldn't talk, so you didn't know for sure, so they would ask the question both ways to make sure that they got the right answer. So he says to the Rebbe, does that mean that the Rebbe wants them to stay? The Rebbe shook his head like this. And he asked again, and the Rebbe a few times, and the Rebbe was very clear, very strongly, that no one should leave. When we got the message, everyone was wondering, how could that be? How could we not leave when they said clearly it's coming straight to Miami Beach, and anybody who was there in Miami Beach. So when you in Miami Beach, it's like an island. So on one side you have the ocean, on the other side you have the bay. And they said there will be a big surge and the water is going to rise, and what's going to happen is that the bay and the ocean are going to meet, and the whole Miami Beach will be underwater. And it's mamish, that's the most dangerous thing. But the Rebbe said not to leave. I remember there was even one lady called me up, that the Rebbe mean that we're going to survive, but I said no, the Rebbe doesn't want us to suffer. If he meant not to leave, he meant not to leave, because nothing's going to happen. But not to go into the details, it was when they came at night, the hurricane came, and I remember they announced that everybody, if anybody didn't leave, should go into a room without windows, because what's going to happen is the hurricane is going to come and break the windows, and the wind will come in and it'll take the roof off. Mamish, dangerous. So we started listening, hearing, and the windows, it sounded like machine guns against the windows. That's how strong the winds were. We were listening to the radio. In the middle of the radio, they said they were talking constantly, reporting about the hurricane, and then it says, we have to make an interruption. We want to give you some news. There is a group of people here in Miami Beach called Lubavitchers, and they're not leaving. They didn't leave because their rabbi in Brooklyn said not to leave. That didn't make any sense. But the Rebbe saw the map and he saw the cone, as they call it, how the hurricane is going to come, and he saw that it's not coming to us. So how could he say not to leave? But Leibel, a lot of details to the story. But Leibel, when the hurricane passed, we went out. Nothing, a little bit of damage, a little bit. The people who left someplace else, where the government said to leave, that's where the hurricane hit mostly. And people there, it wiped out the whole city called Miami City, was wiped out. There was no more houses. People came to the streets later. They couldn't recognize where their house was. They couldn't recognize the streets. That's how it was. At Mamash the Churban, at that time, it was the greatest natural disaster as far as monetary things in the history of the United States. I think later maybe it's something worse. I think it was $20 billion, they said at that time. This goes back in 1991. But as far as anybody of us, so all the people who left couldn't come back in because there was a curfew, whatever it is. And then everybody heard, it was in the newspapers here in New York, articles, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, says after his stroke, sitting in New York, is telling us what to do here. When the government says legally that this is something that is so dangerous, it went up to a 5. So actually, when I called that day, I called Rabbi Groner to speak to the Rebbe. In the afternoon, when they said it's a 5, I called him again. And I said, Rebbe, please go into the Rebbe again and tell the Rebbe that now it's a 5. So he went in again. And again the Rebbe said not to leave, and he said to stay. Like this he made. And then I called a third time when they got to even worse. He says, you know what? I myself am following the news, and I myself went into the Rebbe a third time without you calling me. And the Rebbe said not to leave. So we're thinking then this is mamish, something unbelievable. Years before that, this was Hurricane Andrew. There was a Hurricane David, which happened years before. This is many years before. That's D. So my family, we all left to a different place. But before I left, I called up Rabbi Klein, and I told Rabbi Klein, please go into the Rebbe, write it, settle, that there's going to be a hurricane, ask for a bracha. So when I got finally to the place we went to, I called him up and I said, no, what happened? He says, yes, I went into the Rebbe. I wrote it, settle, writing that there's going to be a hurricane in Miami, and it's very dangerous. So in front of him, the Rebbe wrote down on the settle, Kenire Magzimim. It looks like they're exaggerating. The Rebbe is sitting in Brooklyn in this room, and here the Hurricane Center, which is the scientists, and they're telling you it's dangerous, and he says they're Magzimim. So my client tells me, so he told the Rebbe on the spot, but these are the words he used, Miami, he told me, because I told him we're all afraid what's going to be. So he told the Rebbe that the Lubavitchers in Miami are afraid. After the Rebbe wrote this. And the Rebbe went, And what happened? The place we were the place that borrowed the television, and we were watching the news, and the hurricane is coming to Miami, and all of a sudden in the middle of the night, they say something they don't know what happened, something all of a sudden, it made a turn, and it moved away. So we all said, Avad, the Rebbe made like that, he turned it away. It was a question, the Rebbe turned it away. But this is something that people really then saw that, as we say, yes, tzaddik bi Yisrael, and there is a person, he's mamish, that this is an open miracle that we say. But that's something that we see constantly. One of the biggest miracles is what took place in Russia. The Yiddish guy that stayed in Russia before the Iron Curtain fell, with the Mesiras Nefesh of Yidden, has a lot to do with the Rebbe. It was all because of the Rebbe's hashpoah, that the Rebbe sent people there. The Rebbe had a hashpoah to the Yidden there. I was in Russia. I was sent to Russia as a sachem from the Rebbe through office. I went there. This goes back close to 40 years ago, when the communism was still, and I went underground. And there we were able to see the keach of the Rebbe, because there was a whole group of Yidden there who, Bala Mesiras Nefesh, that learned Torah and had shiurim and did mitzvahs under the circumstances that you can't imagine. And it's all what gave them the chizuk? The Rebbe would write to them. Everything was hidden. Everything was in code. The Rebbe would sign his name, uncle, and sometimes they would call the Rebbe grandfather. But you could see how the people were, and they all attributed. They said the only thing that gave them chizuk is knowing that the Rebbe in America cares about them. And the Rebbe did. You can't imagine how many Farbrengens there were that the Rebbe cried bitter tears for the Jews in Russia. Bitter tears. And whenever he spoke about it, asking David that David should make it easier for them to take him out. But I remember the way they didn't behave there. Everything was a nisoyan. Everything was Mesiras Nefesh. Every little thing Mesiras Nefesh. It's all the kreiches of the Rebbe. I just give you an example. I came there for Purim. I went with my wife. I went a second time with Rabbi Tenenhaus. So we went there for Purim. So Purim at night, after the Tammuz, I said that we went to have a Farbrengen in someone's house. In a big building in someone's apartment. So there were people who went. So when we were going there, we made up that you shouldn't go everyone together. Because if a group comes in, every building at the bottom floor had a guard or somebody there, a man or a woman, watching. Because there in Russia, by the communists, everything you watched. Wherever you went, everyone is watching you. The Big Brother is watching, and it's kipshuta, you could see it. Poshet, everything, there's always people watching, and any little thing that's not the way they want, right away they give over to the KGB. So we made up that we're going to go slowly. 2 people will walk into the building. 5 minutes later, another 2 people, and another 2 people. So the person downstairs shouldn't realize there's some gathering, because to have a gathering, that's the biggest aveda, because then it's some kind of propaganda. So we finally got in, and we sat down to Farbrengen. It was after the Tammuz, after the fast day. I hadn't broken my fast yet, and I didn't want to eat any of the food because I saw they didn't have much themselves, so why should I come from America and eat up their food? But mashke, they had plenty. So I broke my fast with a glass of mashke. And I was speaking to them. In the middle, we hear a knock on the door. This room we were sitting was cheder lifnim cheder, like a room within a room. There's a knock on the door. So everyone became very nervous, including myself, obviously. And the host, the one this was his apartment, got very nervous, walked out, closed the door, walked out. He's very mamish, became pale white. Walks out, comes back in a few minutes later, and he turns to me. I mean, the way we were able to speak some way, because they didn't speak Yiddish, not Russian. I didn't speak Russian. Hebrew a little bit. So he turns around to me. What he did was, he took an empty glass from the table, took the bottle of mashke, filled up the glass, a glass like this. And he turns around to me and he says, Zeh bishvil lahamtik hadinim. To sweeten the judgment. What happened was this Goya, this alta Goya, she's 80 years old, she looked 85 years old, realized after all there was some gathering here, so she went up the steps. And she came knocking on the door. What's going on here? And Stalin, Yamach Shemei, taught them that anything that you see that's suspicious, you got to call the police, call the KGB. So she was ready to call. So she came upstairs to find out. So what he did was he filled up a glass of mashke and was going to take it to her to calm her down. And he walks out with the glass, and 5 minutes later he walks back in with an empty glass. He didn't drink it. She drank it, and he took the bottle and he tells me, he shows me the empty glass and he says, Od lo nimtuku. It didn't do it. She was threatening to go to the KGB. So he took the bottle of mashke, filled up another glass, and he walked out, comes back, and 5 minutes later, K'bar nimtuku. This is how they lived the whole time. You couldn't, I don't want to go into so many details, just one more little thing, just to bring the way we even talk, everything had to be in code. They used to send from America packages to Russia, and the people who got the packages, what was inside, they would sell on the black market, and they could live from that for half a year. Just then the digital watches, came out, and they were ready to send it in the package, but they wanted to know how much ruble they could get for a watch like that. Is it worth to send? Maybe they send something else. So they sent along with us one of them to find out while we were in Russia how much they could get for the black market. And the question was 300 ruble or 400 ruble, which they could live a whole year on 400 ruble. So we got there, we came to this house. Anyway, we gave it to this person, Yudah, he's called, and we told him before we leave, we'll need an answer. So before we left, we came back to the Reb Getch's house, and he called Yudah. I couldn't call because all the phones were bugged, and therefore they would definitely hear a voice that's strange. They would make a tumult. So he calls him up and he says, Yudah, no, what's your answer for the question? He didn't say anything more. So he says to him, the answer is, it's the inyan of Chabad. So he hangs up the phone and he says, the answer is 300 ruble. Ches beis dalet, chochma bina das, Chabad. They didn't want to say anything about ruble. The moment you speak about money. So I say to Reb Getche, he's the one that was saying, Reb Getche, we learn in Chassidus that sometimes das is considered like two. It says, see, you have in the tefillin, you have two shins on top. One with 3, one on 4. So, Api Aloche, what's the reason for a shin made of 4 lines? Because when it says the Aloche Meshem Sinai that there should be 3 lines as a shin, so the shaila is that it means 3 lines or 3 spaces. In order to have 3 spaces, you have to have 4 lines. But Api Kabbalah, it's because the Meyach, the brain, which is the tefillin, is connected Chochma Bina Das. So it's 3. But sometimes Das is considered 2, because Das is the beginning somehow of the midas. Not to go into the Kabbalistic explanation, Chassidus, Das is Nichlek L'Shnayim, it's divided into 2, because Chesed and Gvura sometimes come. So when he comes, hangs on the phone, he says, he told me it's the inyan of Chabad. So I said, it means 3. I said, maybe Das, maybe he means 4, because Das is sometimes divided into 2. So B'getcha says to me, maybe. Picks up the phone, calls him again, says, Yudah, is Das Nichlek L'Shnayim or not? What do you say? Do you think Das is divided into 2? So he says, no, Das is not Nichlek L'Shnayim. He hangs up the phone and he tells me it's 300 ruble, not 400 ruble. But this is the way things were. And all that, the reason that they were able to survive and learn Torah and everything what was a Mesiras Nefesh. I asked one of the people there, he used to arrange some shurim. I said, aren't you afraid? He says, yeah. And so what? We shouldn't do it. But this koyach they got, and that's what they were saying, that the koyach, it started actually with the Friedrich Rebbe when he left Russia, but then, and this goes, and even though, this is what was the biggest enemy of the communists was Chassidus, Lubavitch. A man there, Kalma Melech, told me that he used to also arrange certain things, so the KGB harassed him very much. They called him once, twice, they threatened him. And says, finally, I got the guts to tell him, I don't know what you want from me. According to our constitution, the communist constitution, you're allowed to be religious. So I could be. What's the problem? What do you have? Guess what they answered him? Yeah, you're right. The problem with you is that you're a Lubavitcher. And they didn't say this in 1927 when they arrested the Friedrich Rebbe. This is talking in 1981. Lubavitch was their greatest enemy. Why? The philosophy of the communists was atheism. The philosophy was atheism, not believing in God. Which, by the way, I heard a joke. One of the people there quietly told me a joke. Besides the gematria of Samach, Reish, what are these? Anyway, so I joked that there was in school, the teacher was teaching that there's no God. And the teacher picked up the piece of paper and said, children, do you see a piece of paper? There is a paper. Took a pencil. You see the pencil? Yes, there is a pencil. You see God? No, so there is no God. So one kid gets up. This is a joke they said. One kid gets up and turns to the class and says, does anybody see the teacher's brains? No, the teacher has no brains. This was a very good answer. But their whole philosophy was to uproot Emun and Eibishter. The whole union of Chassidus, of Chabad, is to implant the understanding of Ein Eid Milvadei, that there is nothing but Eibishter. But the truth is, if you speak to people, people say, for that you have to learn Chassidus. You have to be a Chassid and learn. Who doesn't know? Everyone, we all believe in the Eibishter. So there's the famous story that Rabbi Yitzchak Badichever, after he got married, left his young wife and went for 2 years to Mezerich to learn about the Mezritcher Maggid. And his father-in-law was up in arms, was upset. And finally, after 2 years, he comes back. And his father-in-law was screaming at him, what did you go for? What? So I learned. What did you learn? He says, I learned, as ich weiß, as do a Gott auf der Welt. Now I know that there is a God in the world. So he starts screaming at him. For that, you had to go 2 years to Mezritch. He calls in the Jewish maid, whatever her name was, Esther. And he says, Esther, who runs the world? First. So do a Gott auf der Welt. There's a God in the world. So he turns around to his son-in-law. He says, she didn't go for 2 years to Mezritch. And she also says, do a Gott auf der Welt. So he says, yeah, sie sagt und ich weiß. She's saying it. We all say it. Mit der Wissen, like I said before, and this is what Chassidus is all about. To Arai Haknin Kop. No, what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that it's a possibility, a modern Zach, a very strange thing. There's a possibility of Ganve Apum Achtarte Rachmona Karya. Someone goes to steal, and as he's stealing, he davens to Hashem that he should succeed. What kind of Meshuggah is this guy? If he believes in Hashem, why is he stealing? And obviously he believes in Hashem. V'horaya, he's davening to him. And he doesn't believe in Hashem, that Hashem is someplace in the Rekiah Hashvi, in the seventh heaven, there is Hashem there. Because he davens very quietly, he wants no one to hear. So he believes Hashem could hear him. So he believes Hashem is standing right next to him. So why are you stealing? And if you're stealing, why are you davening to Hashem? This guy's a Meshuggah. The answer is, it says in Chassidus that there is such a thing called emunah b'pchinas makif, superficial, ebenufig, makif, which means you believe, but it's not real. When you see a policeman come, if he would see a policeman come, he would not steal, because he knows the policeman is a real person, the handcuffs are real, and he's going to come and take him to jail. The Eibishter is there. He believes in the Eibishter, but that's only belief. It's not real to him. That's what it did. That's why he could steal. He could daven to the Eibishter, believes in the Eibishter, but it's all b'chinas makif. And that's the problem. What has to happen is, we have to have emunah in the pnimius. In the pnimius means, what does a pnimius? It goes in. There's a pasuk that says, Urei emunah. Rei emunah means, not with the aleph, with the ayin. Rei emunah means pasture, eat emunah. How do you eat emunah? You're eating emunah. Emunah is something we understand. We don't eat it. Eat food. Why do we compare emunah to eating? Because there is two things. There is levushim, something on the outside, garments, and then you have food that you eat. You could have emunah like a garment. It's outside. Garment is, it's a nice thing. But you could disguise yourself. You could put on a garment that doesn't belong to you. But food that you eat becomes part, dama bosik psara becomes part of you. Urei emunah, you have to feed on emunah. It means it has to be real to you. As real as the Gashmias is, it has to be real to you that there is a Eibishter and a Neid Mulvade. And there's nothing, and that's real. What they say in English, seeing is believing. Believing. Believe doesn't mean anything. I could believe it. I could say I believe. But to really mean it, you have to know it, knowledge. And that's what Chassidus is. And that's what Chassidus is, complete opposite of what the communism is to ausreißen the Emun of the Eibishter and Chassidus Chabad and B'chol Chassidus. And Chabad Bifrat comes to explain in Yonim that when you come out learning, like now in Chitas, many people I'm sure here learn Chitas, is Shara Yichud V'Emunah, where he talks about explaining the Achdas Hashem, what it means that there's nothing but Hashem. And it's real that way. It's not like it's just superficial, not I believe. That's real. This Bechlal is the job of Moshe Rabbeinu. It says that the job of Moshe Rabbeinu, he's called in Zohar Raya Mehemne. Raya Mehemne means Raya Nemon. Simple pshat means the trustworthy shepherd, a shepherd that you could trust. But Chassidus Taich is Raya Nemon means the shepherd of Emunah. What do you mean a shepherd of Emunah? A shepherd makes sure that his flock eats. Moshe Rabbeinu's job was to make sure that the Yidden eat Emunah. Eat Emunah, that the Emunah goes inside, becomes part of them. This is part of their life. This is real. And by the Rebbe, it's Gimel Tammuz, by the Rebbe, that's the biggest meifes that you could see what the Rebbe did. The Rebbe instilled in the Chassidim Bifrat, in the whole world. What the Rebbe would, the Mefzoim, trying to bring this Yiddishkeit and Eibishter as a fact, as a reality. As a reality. And whether the Torah is real, and the mitzvahs are real, and what it says in Torah is real, and the Eibishter is real. Hashem Elokim Emes Hu Elokim Chaim. Someone told me that during the, I don't know if the 6 Day War, the Yom Kippur War, there was some group of soldiers that were a few soldiers, and they were in a tank, and they saw the enemy coming with a lot of soldiers. They were outnumbered without a question. They didn't know what to do. So one of them took out his film and started putting on film. As soon as he started putting on film, they turned around, they started running away. When they ran away, they started chasing it. And they actually captured one of them, more than one, but one of them was the sergeant, the head, whatever it is. And when they were interrogating him, they asked him, what made you guys run away? You saw that we are a few. So he said, what we saw was that there was somebody put on some boxes with some straps. So we thought that this is some kind of new ammunition that you put on. So we got very scared and we ran away. Actually, the Gemara says this. That the people will see, the nations will see Hashem on your face and they'll be afraid. And the Gemara says, what does this refer to? The tefillin. This person who was involved called Rabbi Grono, the Rebbe's secretary, and said to give over to the Rebbe the story. And he told the story as it is, that they saw that film, they said, and they thought that this is a new ammunition, a kind of ammunition, and they got scared. The Rebbe got very serious, and the Rebbe said, what do you mean they thought this was ammunition? This is ammunition. If the Gemara says this is true, if the Gemara says this is true, there's no two ways about it. Because Torah is like this, you say, well, the Gemara said, if Emunah is b'prinas makiv, you could, believe and not believe. Well, we hate to say we believe in the Eibishter. Because the moment we say we believe in the Eibishter, you know what that means? I believe like this, you could believe different. I mean, there's different opinions. We don't believe there's Eibishter. We don't believe there's Eibishter. We know there's Eibishter. We know that the Torah is emes. We know whatever it says in the Torah is emes. And that's a fact. And that's the life, the way we have to. And that's what the Rebbe did. And is continuing to do through Ishluchim, continuing to do is to instill in the world. Why did the Rebbe start this whole thing with the seeing that even the Goyim keep the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach? Because it's part of Halacha, the Rambam. In the last end of Rambam, he says that there's a Halacha that Yidden have to see that the Goyim keep the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. This is all part of a Hachonah to Mashiach. When Mashiach will come, what is going to happen when Mashiach will come? We all talk about Mashiach, and the Rambam at the end, the Siyem, Harambam, all about Mashiach. What's going to happen when Mashiach will come? So the Pasuk says, "V'nigla k'vei Hashem v'ro kol basar yachdav kipi Hashem diber," that the whole world will recognize Hashem. That's what it is. Mol ha'aretz deyas Hashem. The whole world will recognize Hashem. As a achonah to that, as a preparation, we have to ourselves try to instill in ourselves more the recognition, which is to learn Chassidus, and see to do it to others also. When a person prepares himself, let's say he wants to go to a musical concert, and he wants to be ready to appreciate it. He's going to study music. He's not going to study art. And if he wants to go to recognize and appreciate an art exhibition, he's going to study art. If you want to be ready, hachonah, to the time of Mashiach, when the revelation of Hashem will be there, you got to get ready with this. And that's what the Rebbe was working. The Rebbe taught in the name of the Friedrich Rebbe. It says that you have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, Kol Yemei Chayecha, L'Hov Yemei Mashiach. That means all your life you have to work on bringing Mashiach. And what is that? To instill in ourselves and in the world this recognition of the truth of Hashem. See, some people think that Mashiach, what's going to happen when Mashiach will come? We'll have a lot of food, we'll have a lot of money. They say, they once asked the Alter Rebbe, when is Mashiach going to come? So he said, the Mashiach that everyone is waiting for is not going to come. The one that's going to come, no one's waiting for him. They're waiting for the Gashmias. That's not what it is. That's why some people, see, the Rambam Paskans, in today's shir, the Rambam says, Kol mi she'enim mamim bei, anybody who doesn't believe in Mashiach, or is not waiting for him, is a kaifer, not only in Tanakh, but in Teiras Moshe, in Chumash. Because Chumash says Mashiach will come. What does the Rambam say? Who is it? Somebody doesn't believe in him, or, doesn't say and, or doesn't wait for him. That means you could believe him, but not wait for him. There are a lot of people who believe Mashiach will come, but I'm not waiting for him. If he'll come 10 years later, it's nicht gefährlich. I have Baruch Hashem a nice house and a nice car and I felt fine and I have a lot of money and I have this. Was ist schlecht? Oh, Mashiach will come. They even make this. It's a weltische joke that they say that there's one Poshetari that had a little farm and didn't make any money. Finally, he bought a house and he bought a cow and he was ready to make a living. Comes home one day from shul. He says, a rabbi came to shul and he spoke and he said, Mashiach is coming soon and he's going to take us out from here and take us to Eretz Yisrael. Finally, after 20 years, we establish ourselves and Mashiach is going to take us. So his wife says, listen here, don't worry. Hashem protected us from Haman and from Paray and from this. He'll protect us from Mashiach too. That's how some people think. Those people who do believe it's only when things are not so good. They also, this not time for jokes, but sometimes a joke brings other point. There was once a guy who got a son-in-law and he gave him nadin, he gave him a lot of dowry. And he advised him to take the dowry, the money, and invest it with a certain gvir, with a certain rich man who was very honest, and he made it. And the son-in-law said, no, I'm going to invest it with somebody else. Another guy, not such a great gvir. And his father said, why? This guy is much richer, he'll make much more money. No, he said no. And he invested with the second guy. A few weeks later, they found out that the first guy, the richer man, went bankrupt. So the father-in-law asks him, obviously, you had some inclination. You knew that that's why you didn't want, because there was no other reason. How did you know? How did you know he's going bankrupt? So he says, I happened to walk by when he was talking to a friend, and I happened to hear, I eavesdropped, and I heard him say, it's about time Mashiach comes. I knew he's not doing well. Why would he want Mashiach to come? So I knew he's not doing. That's why some people are. That's not what it is. We have to know that the tachlis of everything is to come to Mashiach, and so many years passed already, and the Rebbe said that we're ready now for Mashiach. It's just holding back a little bit, but soon. That's why I said before, this is the last Siyem Harambam, because the next one will be the time of Mashiach. Already, Mashiach is coming. But we have to, especially today, the Siyem Harambam, when it talks about Mashiach, we have to try to work on that, and knowing that if the Torah says so, it is emes, this is true. But you see other things, just to finish off with also, once, and this Chassidus teaches us. Someone told me he was once waiting here in New York for a bus stop, and it was snowing, and he was waiting. A whole bunch of people were waiting, and the bus didn't come. So he says he turns around to another Yid and he says, "You think the bus is going to come? No, was entfert der Yid? Halavai zal Mashiach kommen, dass schnell wird the bus wird kommen. Halavai Mashiach is come as fast as the bus." So this guy said to him, "I know what you're talking about. The bus, I don't know if it'll come. Mashiach is coming for sure. It says in the Torah, so Mashiach is coming for sure." So he looks at him and says, "Are you a Lubavitcher by any chance?" Anyway, with that I'll finish. L'chaim, l'chaim.